On the demonstrations, let's go to Sahar Khamis. She's an associate professor at the University of Maryland in the Department of Communication. Professor, thank you so much for joining our program today.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure.
Well, I want you to, if you could, first describe the situation at the University of Maryland. How big have the demonstrations been there, and how have university officials responded to them?
Well, thank you so much for having me. University of Maryland, of course, is one big public school in the DMV area, DC, Maryland, and Virginia area. And so far, the atmosphere overall has been calm, much calmer than we have seen in other university campuses across the country. That doesn't mean that there are no student protests. There are some, definitely, for sure. But I believe that the majority of students have actually joined other bigger protests elsewhere, especially the one which is now ongoing in George Washington University campus. There have also been students joining the Georgetown University campus protests. So mainly they have been, emerging and mingling with the other bigger protests at other close by university campuses. I should also give some credit to University of Maryland actually for, trying to accommodate all the different sides, trying to give, equal voices to all the different student bodies, and not cracking down on protesters or activists or those who have different views, as we have sadly seen in other cases like Columbia University and others.
That actually is a great segue into my next questions. You know, universities haven't seen these kinds of widespread protests in some time, and they're trying to strike this delicate balance between, protecting freedom of speech of these students, but also ensuring safety and order on campus. So, as you mentioned, some of these universities have taken different approaches. MIT, UC Berkeley are taking a more hands-off approach to the large encampments on campus, not bringing in police. Whereas on the flip side of that, I think we have some video of Emory University, an example of where things got out of control, where a professor there was violently arrested by police. As a professor of communication and media, you know optics are important at these institutions. So what is the most appropriate approach, do you think, for colleges to take in this kind of situation?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Francis. It's always important to strike this delicate balance between freedom of speech and freedom of expression and academic freedom, which have always been very important, beacons and important backbones of American democracy. America has always been talking about these important principles being the foundations and the basis of its own system. So in order to crack down on peaceful protesters on campuses, that's completely against these important values and does do a lot of harm, actually, to the image of the United States nationally and internationally. So universities really have this responsibility to strike this delicate balance between giving its own students the space and the place to have peaceful protests and to make sure their voices and concerns are heard, and of course making sure that there is no hateful actions or violence of any sort, because it's important not to inflict any kind of harm on anyone, even if they hold a different position or a different stance. As I said, I'm proud of my own university for being able to strike this very important and sensitive balance. Unfortunately, things have gone out of hand in other campuses, especially as we have seen in Columbia University, and how the use of violence and arrests of students and suspensions and all of that led to a backfiring and counter effect, which led to triggering even more student protests worldwide.
Professor, how much of a difference do you think these protests will make in terms of influencing these universities about their Israel stance, and more broadly, the Biden administration and its support of Israel, particularly as we look towards the November presidential elections? This is a crucial voting bloc here in the U.S.
Well, absolutely. These are very, very important, pressing, timely, and sensitive issues. There is no question about it. Some of the students' demands have been divestment, which means basically asking their universities to stop investing in different forms of, economic investment or companies that might be supporting the war machine in Israel, and saying, we don't agree with these policies. It's very important to divest from these investments. There was one attempt to do so at the University of Maryland. It did not go through. It did not pass through successfully. And I suspect the same happened in other campuses as well. However, the students are persistent. They're trying, they're raising their voices, and they're trying to push forward in this direction. But of course, change is not going to happen overnight. It might be a lengthy and difficult process. On the broader political scheme, and that's a very, very important point, we are coming closer and closer to the November 2024 presidential election. And let me remind you that these demonstrations and protests are now only very few blocks away from the White House. You are hearing these chants not just in support of Palestine and solidarity with the Palestinians, but also against the Biden administration's handling of the Gaza crisis and its own course of action. And of course, here the bigger question becomes, how could these protests and demonstrations impact the image of Biden and his own government, as well as his chances of winning a second term in the White House?
Professor, our last question, if you could keep it brief a little bit. How do you see these protests unfolding in the next few weeks and months? It seems like momentum is really building here. Do you think that these protests will go on for the long term, possibly through November?
I think that at least for the coming few weeks, for sure, and even maybe for the coming few months, we're going to see some of these protests across different U.S. campuses. And let me just remind you, it's not just about students. There are also faculty members and staff and even members of the public who have been joining these growing protests and demonstrations all over the United States. And my expectation is that this is going to continue as a momentum for the coming weeks and months, with very possible implications and effects on the presidential election of 2024.
Dr. Sahar Khamis with the University of Maryland. Thank you so much, Professor, for your insight today.
Thank you so much.